MacVoices is sponsored by lynda.com. Expand your skills. Improve yourself. Get a free 10-day trial of all lynda.com has to offer at lynda.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the Talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we have Shelly Brisbin back with us. She is the author of the new iOS Access for All, iOS 8 edition. And we're going to talk about accessibility in iOS 8 and what Apple is doing about it. Shelly, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. It's a pleasure as always.
The last time we talked about one of your books, I got, I don't know about you, but I got a lot of positive response. And that's why when I saw this come out, I was really anxious to have you back on the show, get an update on iOS 8 accessibility, what you cover in the book, and maybe just what's going on in accessibility in the Apple world.
Sure, I'd love to.
So let's start with the book and what's new in iOS 8 from an accessibility standpoint.
So the goal of my book, which came out for iOS 7 middle of last year, was to cover all of the accessibility features in iOS, including those that had sort of accidental accessibility benefits. And so I arranged the book in terms of different disabilities and accessibility needs and tried to be really comprehensive about how I covered from the point of view of the accessibility rather than just, well, this feature is in this category or whatever. And so what I did in iOS 8 was update using the same structure and the same content with the addition of the things that Apple had added in iOS 8. And there were some substantial ones. There's a bit of a new look, but mostly the accessibility features that you know from iOS 7 are still there. They still do the same thing, but things have been added. Particularly in the low vision area, the zoom feature was really upgraded so that before you could, zoom in on your screen, which is a pretty straightforward concept, but now you have the ability to control it much more finely. And we talk about that a little as we go along. And there were some additions to VoiceOver that allowed you to get your to type on the screen or enter text on the screen in new ways. The feature called Braille Screen Input, for one. And then there were a few tweaks to features, including guided access and assistive touch. And those are features that are used by people a lot of times in classrooms for helping people on the autism spectrum or other students that have difficulty focusing on a task. And so those features make it possible. The guided access feature makes it possible for teachers and others to help those students. And then assistive touch and switch control are both features that assist people with physical motor disabilities, and there have been some small tweaks made to those features as well. And so basically the book is an update of what I've done before with all the iOS 8 goodies highlighted.
It sounds like that's a lot, and I want to make sure we get into some depth on at least a few of them. Forgive me because I'm not sure that I'm going to get the title right, but did you say the Braille entry screen?
It's a feature called Braille Screen Input, and what that means is you can, if you're not familiar with the way Braille works, it's a 6-dot cell, and so when you write in Braille, you're using combinations of dots to create letters and alpha characters, and with Braille Screen Input, you're able to actually type those 6 dots on the iOS screen. There have been apps previously, mBraille being the probably most prominent of them, that have allowed you to do this. And so in iOS 8, Apple has added this feature. And you might say to yourself, well, why would somebody want to Braille on the screen with 3 fingers of each hand? Why would they want to do that? Well, there are a lot of people who are native Braille users. The way that you would Braille with an iOS device if you didn't have Braille Screen Input is with a device called Refreshable Braille Display, which is a very expensive device, several $1,000s. And a lot of blind folks, and particularly deaf-blind folks, use refreshable Braille displays. But if you don't have one, and if you're a native Braille user, the ability to actually enter Braille characters on the screen, which are then translated into text and read to you via VoiceOver so that you can do the editing that you need, is a pretty cool addition.
Forgive me because I'm having trouble visualizing how this works, especially given that the iPhone, iPad are completely flat screens. How do you get any kind of feedback?
So once you enable Braille Screen Input, you have 6 dots on the screen, dots 1 through 6, and those dots are and you use 3 fingers of each hand to make the dots. The feedback comes through voiceover. So if the dot combination 1, 2, and 3 is the character F. So if I type F, voiceover says F to me. Or I can set it so that it doesn't give me feedback until I've completed the word or the sentence. And it will let you do this in what's called contracted Braille or uncontracted Braille. Contracted Braille allows you to substitute 1 or 2 characters for an entire word. So it makes Braille a little easier to type. And so you essentially just lay the device flat on the table, or as a lot of people do. This is the thing that amazes me. I use Braille, but I don't do it every day. And Braille screen input allows you to either lay your device flat on the table and essentially tap out the Braille dots and get the feedback through voiceover, or there's a different mode that allows you to hold the device so that you can just customize it. It can feel more comfortable to you, as opposed to just having to have, if you're sitting on the bus or if you're walking, I guess you could do Braille screen input in that position. And then from that point on, once the Braille has been entered, it's translated into text, and then voiceover takes over. And so just as if you were typing on the virtual keyboard or using a Bluetooth keyboard with voiceover, you have the same text entry and editing options. The voiceover can read to you by character, word, or line, and then you can go back through the text and cut, copy, paste just as you can in the normal way. And Braille screen input is just an alternative way of entering the text in the first place, and then voiceover takes over for the editing part.
At this point, I got to tell you, I'm a little embarrassed at any of us that don't have sight challenges that complain about the virtual keyboard. I mean, this sounds. I'm sure, just like anything else, when you get practiced with it, you can become very efficient with it. But it sounds like there's a bit of a learning curve to it.
Well, but see, that's true of voiceover in general. And I think one of the things I tried to do, and when I wrote the book in the first place, I talked to a lot of voiceover users, and many of them were better than me at it, because it's in my native. I'm low vision, but my native way of interacting with my iOS device is not voiceover. So I had to learn to be really proficient at it in order to explain it. And what I learned was that it was really important to walk people along slowly and let them know that it was going to get easier. It gets better, to borrow a phrase. There is a learning curve, but once you get it, it's quite speedy. And there's been some additional things that have been added to OS 8 that makes it even easier to work with voiceover. There's a feature called direct touch typing, which to somebody who hasn't used voiceover probably looks pretty amazing. But what it allows you to do is essentially type on the virtual keyboard without first locating specifically where the key is, so where the key you're intending to type is. So it essentially uses a combination of predictive text features to guess at what you're trying to type. And once you get good at it, there's a high level of accuracy that you can develop, but you can't learn it in one sitting. And so there are quite a number of people who before they get good at it, get frustrated. And so if you read my book, without trying to work out the steps yourselves, a lot of what you'll see is, come on, you can do it. Not in those words, but essentially encouragement to move forward very slowly. And what I do is I give people really simple steps, how to type in the 3 different typing modes that VoiceOver provides, and then how to cut and copy text. And then we move on to more complicated things, how to check your spelling and that sort of thing. But it really is once you get over the wall, it's easy. Well, I wouldn't say easy, but once you get over the wall, it's a very effective way to interact with your device. But before you get over the wall, it can be really challenging.
Just like all of us had to learn that again, from my perspective, not sight impaired, we had to learn the process, I guess, of using the virtual keyboard. This is just another way of interacting with it, and I would assume for sight challenged people, this is a system, or it's a routine that they have to go through with a lot of things.
Yeah, it is very much analogous to that, and the virtual keyboard is, I think it's a challenge, and it's funny to talk to people, because the way I break out the methods of interacting, if you're a VoiceOver user with your device, I break it out into typing on the virtual keyboard, typing with a braille display, typing with a Bluetooth keyboard, handwriting, dictation, all the various methods. And if you looked at it straight on and you didn't have any experience, you'd probably think, well, dictation is probably the easiest method. I would just dictate all the time because you press the button and you say what you're going to say, and then you go back and you edit it if it's necessary. But if you talk to a lot of blind users who are experienced, dictation slows them down. And they would much rather use voiceover and direct touch typing. And so you're exactly right that it's like getting used to the virtual keyboard and all of the quirks of whether you're going to use it in portrait or landscape mode, or whether it's easier on an iPhone or an iPad. And it's kind of amazing that it can be done, not in a sort of warm and fuzzy inspirational way, but just that learning curve it's really straight up, and then once you're on the other side, it's pretty straightforward.
This edition of Mac Voices is sponsored by lynda.com, the unparalleled online video training library. The new year is here. Okay, the new year's been here for about a month. What did you do with that month? If you'd been using lynda.com, you could have learned all sorts of new things. Maybe picked up some expertise in photography. Maybe upped your game in the web development area and spruced up your website. Or maybe figured out a little more about just what you should be doing with social media. Those are all courses that are available at lynda.com, and they're just the start. Business, design, software training on a huge number of programs, and more. And the great thing about lynda.com is that once you subscribe, you can watch and learn as much as you want. No limitations. If you're under deadline and need expertise in something, you could watch 24 hours a day to get to where you need to be. Pick what you want to learn, and then take it a step at a time, or do a deep dive. It's all up to you. But don't take my word for it. You can get a 10-day free trial by visiting lynda.com/MacVoices, and that will let you explore any and all of the videos on lynda.com for free. Again, no limits, no restrictions, just pure, solid learning for 24 hours straight, if you can stay awake that long. Some of my favorites are from some friends who share their knowledge via lynda.com. Experts like Christopher Breen and his new macOS Yosemite Tips and Tricks course. Or Derek Story and his Managing Your Mobile Photos course. Or Deke McClelland and his ongoing Deke's Techniques series that will help you become the graphics master you've always wanted to be. And you can watch when, where, and how you want, Mac, iPad, or iPhone. lynda.com has all the options covered. If you want to learn something, and I mean really learn it, I'll bet you'll find it on lynda.com. Do us both a favor and sign up for the 10-day free trial at lynda.com/MacVoices and give it a try. I bet you'll become addicted to how easy it is to learn and how much fun it is to learn. That's lynda.com/MacVoices for a 10-day free trial, no restrictions, no limitations. Thanks to lynda.com for their support of Mac Voices. The fact that using dictation, you're absolutely right. I would have thought that would have been a bit of a boon to a sight-challenged user. And that makes me want to go back for a second. And you said earlier that using VoiceOver can slow you down, that VoiceOver can be a challenge. Can you explain that to me as to why that slows you down, or it just,
using VoiceOver?
Well,
oh, you mean dictation?
Well, no more the VoiceOver question. I mean,
okay.
the voice, okay. Because again, a lot of us don't use VoiceOver, so we don't understand why that would be a challenge.
Well, the way VoiceOver works, obviously, if you're typing on the virtual keyboard, obviously you have to orient yourself with that keyboard, and VoiceOver provides different methods of typing. The standard method of typing is essentially, let's just call it hunt and peck. It's as if you're typing one key at a time, you're getting your VoiceOver feedback, then you have to locate the next key using VoiceOver. That takes forever. Fortunately, the direct touch typing and the touch typing modes that are included with VoiceOver make it possible, once you get comfortable with standard typing, to move on to a method that's easier and doesn't actually require you to type one key at a time. The method becomes more analogous to the way anybody would type on a computer keyboard, or the way a sighted user would type on a virtual keyboard, where you might not necessarily be looking at every key as you type. You're just making progress and fixing typos as you go along. So the challenge is really that you're doing, one key at a time. Now that's just text entry. The other parts of using VoiceOver, where you're navigating around your device, where you're reading, those are very straightforward. I think, and I say in the book, the hardest part about using VoiceOver is typing. Everything else is very intuitive. Gestures that are familiar to non-visually impaired users are modified for VoiceOver users. So for example, if you're a VoiceOver user, instead of tapping on an app to open it, you would double tap it, because first, VoiceOver needs to indicate to you that you're in the right place so that you find the app. So if a single tap on an app will say its name, and then you double tap to open it and so on. There are a number of flick gestures that allow you to scroll the entire screen of text and read through text and use iBooks to flip pages. And all of those things are very straightforward. And I can make you a productive reader and device user in 15 minutes with VoiceOver. That's not hard. So when I say VoiceOver is a challenge for people, what I really mean is once I sit them down and I say, let's start typing, that's when it's a challenge. Now, it's a heck of a lot easier if somebody has a Bluetooth keyboard, but that's not always convenient. If you're an iPhone user, you don't necessarily carry around a keyboard, although there are a lot of little tiny keyboards that people use. So I guess that would be my summary is that the entering and editing text is probably the most challenging part for a new VoiceOver user.
At the risk of taking us away from the book, we'll go there for just a second, but that is something I was wondering about. In the case of an iPad, it's a little easier. In the case of an iPhone, obviously a little more difficult, but are there Bluetooth keyboards or keyboard accessories that facilitate the process?
Well, there's nothing special about a Bluetooth keyboard for a VoiceOver user. There are commands that a Bluetooth keyboard supports that help VoiceOver users. There's a function called Quick Nav that allows you to navigate through a text document quickly using the arrow keys. And that's a feature that's duplicated on macOS VoiceOver, by the way. But there's no reason that any Bluetooth keyboard that will work with an iDevice will be perfectly useful to a VoiceOver user.
Okay. So we've gone down this path quite a bit. How about if we jump to something else in iOS
Sure.
8 that you think is important to know? Because as you've ripped off quite a list of things at the beginning.
Yeah, because I wrote about them for months and months. So I tend to speak in bullets at this point. Well, the low vision feature. Now, when just to take you back a little bit, when iOS 7 came out, it was a huge change visually. I think we talked about this last time, that for low vision users, iOS 7 was a big challenge. And there were a lot of the complaints people had about the new design and the thin fonts and all that. That was magnified, forgive the pun, hundreds of times for low vision users. And when iOS 7.1 came out, I said that was the first low vision upgrade. You could just stamp low vision because they made so many minor but very important improvements to the way somebody could alter the appearance of their iOS device to account for their own low vision issues. And iOS 8, they surprised me again by going even further. And this time they actually added new features instead of just tweaking things that I think they got wrong in the initial iOS 7. So iOS 8 was also a nice low vision upgrade. Is it perfect? No. And the thing I always say about low vision, and again, I'm somebody who has low vision, but the thing I always say about low vision is every low vision user's needs are different. So it's much harder to say, okay, you're low vision. What do you want in your iDevice? I can tell you what I want, but I can't tell you what my friend over there wants because different conditions cause low vision. People have different degrees of low vision based on their age and so on and so on. But just to get to the features in iOS 8, as I mentioned before, the zoom feature was improved substantially. There's a tool now called the Zoom controller that's a little pop-up that allows you to, actually that's the Zoom pop-up. There's also a Zoom controller, but we'll get to that in a second. So the Zoom pop-up allows you to not only change the level of magnification of your entire screen, but it allows you to zoom in on a part of the screen, say an area, a window of the screen, then move around. That's really useful for an iPad user. So if you don't want to zoom in so much on an iPad that you're only looking at a tiny amount of real estate, you can zoom in on just a window. Say, for example, I use that feature a lot when I want to read the clock at the top of my iPad because that's kind of tiny. But if I can just zoom in on the window real quick and then zoom back out, then I can find out what time it is and move on. In addition, there are filters that allow you to change the color and contrast of just the zoomed area, which is kind of awesome because if you want to change to a negative image, for example, but only want to do so on the zoomed window, you can do that in the zoom pop-up. There are a couple of other filters that I'm blanking on right now. And one of my favorite features that's part of the Zoom collection, if you will, is that you can, if you're typing, say, a form, you can zoom in on the actual form field that you're typing, but leave the virtual keyboard at the normal size. So you can actually see what you're typing if magnification is something that's not helpful to you if you're low vision. So that's really fun. In addition to, so they've done a really nice job with adding useful features to Zoom. And I enjoy it because, and you can get in and out of them very quickly. You can do a two-finger triple tap to enter or exit Zoom, and then you can do a three-finger triple tap to get the Zoom controller and interact with just part of the screen zoomed in, or the whole screen if you choose to do that. Another feature that I call I just nickname stuff sometimes, and I call this one casual voiceover. So if you're a low vision user, you might not always need speech for the entire iOS interface. For example, a lot of times you might only need it to read an iBook or something or a long email or something like that, even though you're able to navigate the interface visually just fine. And so Speak Screen allows you to essentially have the screen that you're looking at right now read to you. And if you're reading a web page, for example, it'll scroll and read the whole web page. And you first invoke it in settings, and then you do a two-finger downward flick, and it will speak the entire contents of the screen. Apple has made that even better in iBooks, and it also works in the Nook and Kindle apps and several other reading apps, where Speak Screen will turn pages for you and it'll continue to read through the book, and you have a couple of controls that allow you to skip forward and back. And you may ask, well, why is that different than VoiceOver? Well, as I say, you don't have to enter the VoiceOver gesture environment. You still have the ability to move in and out of that app without having to interact with VoiceOver gestures. So if you only temporarily need speech, Speak Screen is great. And with the Alex voice, which has been available on macOS for a while and was available since the iPhone 5S, with the Alex voice now on most current iOS models, including the iPads, Speak Screen or any speech is really a joy, because that voice is such a high quality, such an improvement over a lot of the other voices that ship with iOS.
There's so many things that when we started having this conversation that I feel a bit inadequate, because this is an area that I don't work in or have experience with. So I have to turn to you and say, what else do we have? Because I just don't know what's important.
Well, see, that's why I write. That was the big motivation when I wrote this book, was so often people don't. I used to get a little upset when I found that people weren't talking about accessibility in iOS or Mac OS. And then I realized that it was just that it's such a deep pool. And if you're not living it every day, it's not something that you're going to have an opportunity to get fluent in. So that's kind of why I did what I did.
I'm glad you did. I'm glad, because it is fascinating. And when iOS 8 comes out, when Yosemite came out, we all do the same thing. We're quick to criticize those things that affect us or that annoy us or that we really love. And so accessibility, you're right. If you're not living it every day, I guess it's sort of like, gaming or graphics or anything. If you don't do them, then the criticisms and all just go right by you and you don't really care.
Well, and I think what happens too is that people who I think most people who know something about Apple and who spend time in the Apple universe have the general perception that Apple does a great job with accessibility. It's come from the top. There's been a commitment to it. Obviously, there's been a high rate of adoption. If you talk to most blind folks who have a choice about a smartphone, Apple tends to win. And so I think there are a lot of people in the mainstream world, which is kind of our shorthand in the accessibility community for folks that aren't part of that community. A lot of folks in the mainstream world will, look, accessibility is handled, so I don't have to worry about that. And that's not even really a criticism. It's just the point is, because Apple has such a good record, there's a tendency to think, well, accessibility is something I don't really have to think about. And I guess my answer to that would be that in the accessibility community, we're just like, you're right, it's like graphics or gaming or any community. the meat is in the details. And so when we get a new OS, we open up accessibility settings and we see if there's something new. And when I found Speak Screen and those Zoom features, I was really excited because it made a material difference in my life. But there are also instances in which Apple makes mistakes and when there are bugs. There were some bugs in iOS 8 that had to do with VoiceOver. There was a lot of debate in the accessibility Twitterverse about whether OS 8 was too buggy, that shouldn't have been released with some of the VoiceOver bugs, and how serious those VoiceOver bugs were. And so it gets just as animated and just as passionate as any other community of Mac users, especially a special interest type of community, like you say, graphics or gaming or Photoshop or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm going to adopt your nomenclature about the mainstream, because I've been trying to find a way to designate it, and I guess that is a good way to say it, as if anything on the Mac is mainstream, because we Mac and the iOS devices, we all use them as we see fit. And we all have our particular needs and wants. And you're right. If I could design the next this or that, I would do it to the things that I do. You would do it to the things you do. But the whole accessibility, you get down to that usability of the operating system itself, whether it's Yosemite or iOS 8. That's something that really is the bedrock on which we all, I think, judge. And so for the non-mainstream community, their bedrock is being messed with and hopefully improved.
In general, it is being improved. And I think it's, like I say, we get as passionate, and sometimes we're as right and sometimes we're as wrong as any other community. So what I was getting at with what I was saying about the VoiceOver bugs, and I wasn't really very clear about it, is that there were bugs in OS 8 to do with VoiceOver. And there were some people who very passionately thought this meant that the whole release was terrible. And there were other people who said, well, those are fairly minor bugs and Apple will straighten it out and it'll get better. And there are other people who said, I'm not having that problem. What are you even talking about? So it's just like, it's just as like any other user community. And, the challenge that accessibility users tend to have is we're sometimes not sure whether we're being heard, whether it's by Apple or whether it's by other developers. And we can talk about that a little later, too, if you want to. But there are issues to do with how and whether developers accept accessibility. And I think what's been clear with Apple, and I have never been the kind of Apple fangirl who would just give them credit where I didn't think they deserve it. I give them praise when they deserve it and don't give them praise when they don't. But the thing that a lot of us who've been around it for a while always say in the community is Apple does a really good job of the breadth of features are really good. The number of people in the accessibility community who have some sort of inside track on what's happening with Apple accessibility has surprised me and is really pretty good. And so are there features that could be improved? Absolutely. But there are also things that there's always been progress in every operating system. The biggest disappointment that we had, that I had personally, was iOS 7, because from a low vision point of view, it was kind of a disaster. And they fixed it, and they didn't fix it for us. There were accessibility enhancements in 7.1 and beyond, but they ended up fixing it for the larger iOS using community, and that happened to benefit us. And there's still people who have some low vision accessibility issues with iOS. And I always advise people, especially low vision people, if you're not sure whether an iOS device is right for you, and if you're afraid of some of the visual design elements, then please go to an Apple store or otherwise get your hands on one of those devices and spend some time with it. Because the other great thing is that it's so easy to enable the accessibility features that you can actually have a meaningful experience while you're standing there in a retail environment and figure out whether this device is going to be easy for you to operate. Even if the folks at the store may or may not be familiar enough to help you, there's enough information out there that you can very quickly access those features and get some sense of whether those devices are going to be a good fit for you.
I'm so glad you explained the fact that accessibility, it's not handled and it's not all the same, because I think there is a tendency for the mainstream community to think in those terms that, okay, we have a sight challenge person, we have a hearing challenge person, so there are these 10 features or 20 features or whatever for that, and that's it. And you don't stop to think, if you're not part of it, that you're right, different conditions create different challenges in those spectrums, and that means that some of those features may be right on point and others may be completely missing the mark.
Yeah, and it is frustrating sometimes because of that sort of what I call the checkmark mentality, where if you're in the mainstream community, you're like, well, Apple does a great job with accessibility, so they're done, right? It's hard to explain, and sometimes it's not even necessary to explain, but it's hard to explain this is a major lack, this is not, to somebody who's not living it every day. And the reason I say it's not necessary to explain is I would hope that folks in the accessibility community would be trusted and frankly be consulted. So if people are writing about accessibility as a part of something else that they're doing, if people are evaluating Apple accessibility as part of a larger a review of iOS, or whether they're trying to understand what Apple's done in terms of accessibility, I would really encourage them to consult people that use and work with this stuff on a daily basis, because there are a lot of users, but there are also a lot of professionals. There are a lot of people in rehabilitation environments whose job it is to train folks who get new accessibility devices, people who have been newly blinded, for example, or have just acquired a disability, or maybe they're students in a school system or whatever. There are a lot of professionals who do this every day, and a lot of geeks like me who write about it every day, and a lot of users who are extremely they're geeks who use accessibility just like they're geeks in every other Mac iOS special interest world. And believe me, they're geeky as all get out. And so I guess my wish for the mainstream community is not that they necessarily understand all the nuts and bolts. I'll tell you all day long what the thing will do and what it won't do and what's good and what's bad. But I think trusting the people who use this stuff on a daily basis as a resource would go a long way toward, and that applies obviously to interacting with developers too, who have some role in providing accessibility in their apps. And so Apple kind of gets that message. Like I said before, Apple has really done a good job of finding different ways to integrate people who use accessibility into the programs that they have, whether it's through there are several certified educators that I know that specialize in accessibility related work. There are people in various beta programs. There are people who have training consultancies that they do that are related to accessibility, and Apple supplies them with good amounts of information. And so I don't know where I was going with that, except to say that the accessibility community and our interaction with Apple and with technology in general is just as robust and just as knowledgeable as any other interest group or sort of subset of technology users out there.
I want to make sure we go back to the book, but that's a point I want to reiterate. I guess I admit I never thought about it, but for a lot of developers, when they're doing beta tests, when they're getting feedback, it would make a lot of sense to at least include some accessibility community members in that, recognizing that you're not going to be, as you said, you're not going to be able to satisfy them all with exactly what they want in all likelihood, but it's going to at least give you a shot at it and get you in the ball game.
And you can tell when developers have done that. The folks who there are some great apps out there that are mainstream apps that the developers have bent over backwards to provide accessibility, and there are a lot where they haven't, and they get accidental accessibility benefits, and there are a few who unfortunately have been laggards. But you can really tell when a developer engages with folks in the accessibility community. It shows in the little touches in their app. It's not just a matter of flipping a switch and saying it's voiceover capable, which means all the buttons are labeled and all the functions that you can do in the app are accessible to voiceover. But there end up being nice little touches. Like, for example, an app like Instapaper has really great manipulation features in it that allow you to change the fonts and do night views and various other things that help a lot of people who may or may not be technically disabled or accessibility users, but because the developer of that app talked to a lot of people in the accessibility community, the voiceover support is robust, and those features that help low vision users make the most of the app are very robust as well. And then there are a lot of apps there are a lot of developers that have just taken an interest in building accessible apps, and they've been it's not hard to find folks in the accessibility community. Like I say, they're on Twitter out there just like everybody else is. And so if you're a developer and you're looking to communicate with people in the accessibility community about your app, it's not a hard nut to crack.
And in a world where everyone's looking for a way to differentiate their app, this seems like a community that would welcome an app that has been tuned for them. So it's one way to appeal to a different segment of the market, and again, differentiate yourself, because there are a lot of developers that are not focusing on this particular audience.
Yeah, I think more and more they are. I mean, there aren't as many just out and out examples of blatant ignorance of accessibility that you saw several years ago that there were. And obviously you can find bad apps. One thing that happens, since we're talking about developers, this is something important that a lot of people don't realize. So we all have the ability to update our apps automatically in iOS. Well, a lot of VoiceOver users particularly don't turn that on, because often an app update will inadvertently break accessibility, will break VoiceOver support for some reason. Maybe the new button placements were not labeled correctly, or maybe there was an overlay or something that wasn't made visible to VoiceOver, or maybe they took advantage of something in the Apple interface that creates a menu structure that hasn't been tuned for VoiceOver. And so what most experienced VoiceOver users for iOS know is, maybe I shouldn't do that automatic update. Maybe I should take a look or find out from the community whether this app breaks accessibility, because there's nothing more frustrating than having your favorite app updated and then find you can't use it.
That happens to all of us.
Yes. That's
but for the accessibility community, it's potentially even more devastating. So.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, because really it's essentially turned off. You know, you bought the app, or whether you bought the app or whether you didn't, you have a favorite app. App X is your favorite app. You love App X. You use it every single day. And then, version 3.2.6.8 comes out, and you're not even paying attention because it was updated when you were asleep. And you get up the next morning and you open up App X, and you can't read it.
Yeah. And if that's your calendar app, or if that's the thing that you depend on.
So it could be your reading app, it could be your planner, whatever. But whatever level of importance you attach to it. And again, like it's usually inadvertent, and a lot of developers, I mean, obviously the more major and the more well-known the app, the more likely it is that the developer will listen when you go, hey, could you fix it? Could you know how it worked before? Could you make it do that again, at least? And so people have gotten kind of used to that. And again, Twitter is kind of amazing in that regard, because somebody will say, this, I mean, I won't pick on specific apps, but let's say it's a travel app, for example. Well, I'm on a trip, and so XYZ airline broke their travel app, and I'd kind of like to use it before I get home. I'm going to get on Twitter, and I'm going to say, any chance you could get out a little update before I come home from my trip?
Good point. Good point. So let's spin back to the book. I don't know how we got on this tangent, but it really is fascinating, and I hope the developers out there are listening to this and maybe
hope so too.
appreciate the accessibility challenges and just the things that make perfect sense from what you're saying. But $10 says they have not really thought it out enough, unless it's happened to them and they've gotten that backlash of Twitter feedback. So hopefully they're paying attention. What else do we have in iOS 8 that you feel is specifically worth highlighting and recognizing as really beneficial?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I guess it's worth pointing out that a number of apps have gotten updates to their interfaces, and so there are a few little tweaks. For example, calendar app was always kind of a challenge for again, I go back to the low vision user, because skeuomorphism was your friend as a low vision user, because you could relate something visually to something you recognized. And so, and I said this about iOS 7, that calendar was kind of baffling for people, and it wasn't immediately clear what button did what, and that's steadily improved. And I think iOS, I don't know if it's 8 or 8.1, I honestly can't remember at this point, but there have been a few little subtle improvements to the way calendar works that are nice. There are a couple of new gestures in Mail that VoiceOver makes pretty good use of the actions feature that usually is used for deleting apps, or for deleting content within apps, or moving content, or otherwise manipulating it. And VoiceOver makes pretty good use of that. No, we've gotten to most of it. Like I said, there are a couple of changes to guided access that allow you to time guided access sessions. Guided access, again, is basically a tool that allows you to restrict the use of the iOS device to one app and even to block off certain areas of the screen. So, for example, if you have a kid that you want to stay in an educational app, or maybe you want them to watch a movie, a video, but you don't want them to have access to the playback controls, you can mask that off so that they don't have the ability to get out of that app. And now there is the ability to add a timer function to that. Let's see, what else? I think that, and obviously there have been some changes in Siri Siri is not an accessibility feature, but it is of great value to those of us in the accessibility world. There are more hearing aids supported. This isn't a feature or something that's added, but I remember when iOS 7 came out, or shortly after iOS 7 came out, Apple talked about support for hearing aids, and they had an Apple certified hearing aid program. And at the time, there weren't any actual products out on the market, and now I think there's something like there might be 10 from 4 or 5 manufacturers. So my understanding is, and again, it's a little out of my depth, although I've written about it, but I haven't had personal experience with it. But my understanding is that Apple has done a pretty good job, not only of supporting new hearing aid products, but also adding some pretty cool features that allow you to use the iPhone as an enhancement to your hearing aid, and to actually use it as an additional microphone so that you can boost the reception of your hearing aids and have that feedback to your ears. So that covers it, really. Like I say, there are a few app-related things, but it wasn't. I don't think, from an accessibility point of view, iOS 8 was not a full version upgrade. It might have been like a 0.5 level upgrade, except for the great new low vision features and some of the additions to VoiceOver, which are nice. But still, all in all, it's been a pretty positive upgrade.
So let's just talk about the approach of the book this time. Obviously, with iOS 8, it's not supposed to be an iOS 8 book. It's an iOS 8 accessibility book. Yeah. This doesn't, though, just list everything that we've been talking about here. It actually walks folks through using those features and gives them some tips on how to use them.
Yep. It's step by step. So I've organized the book into 3 parts. The first part introduces sort of the Apple landscape. So I cover the ecosystem, I cover the devices, I cover the various services. Then the next chapter of that section, I do basically a quick start that says, if you're in a hurry, here's how to start using all the accessibility features. And I point out that, especially in the case of VoiceOver, you're going to need some sighted assistance to initially use it if you're going to go the quick start route. Then I do chapters 3 through 7 are focused on individual sets of accessibility features that are around a different disability category. So chapter 3 is for blind users, chapter 4 is low vision. Chapter 5, I just stuck the Siri chapter in the middle because Siri tends to be a feature that people with different accessibility issues use. Chapter 6 is hearing impaired, and chapter 7 is physical, motor, and cognitive disabilities. And so within each of those chapters, I document all of the accessibility features that are relevant. And then I do a lot of step-by-steps to show people how to go in the case of VoiceOver specifically, because there's a different process for it. I go all the way from configuring your iOS device in the first place with VoiceOver, because if you start from scratch and do it the quote unquote the long way, you can configure your iOS device out of the box without sighted assistant as a VoiceOver user. And I show you how to do that in excruciating detail. And of course, the challenge is, if you're using an iOS device for the very first time, you don't know any VoiceOver gestures yet. So it's great that you can turn on VoiceOver, and when you open the device up, it's easy to do that. But if you don't know any gestures, you're going to have a little trouble connecting to your Wi-Fi network. So what I do is I go step by step. I teach you the gestures that you need to configure your device. And by the time you've got your device configured, you know about 10 or 12 gestures already. And so we can then move into text entry and editing, how to use the 5 different methods of text entry that work with VoiceOver. And then I do a section about how to manage and navigate your device using VoiceOver. And the other chapters that with different disability categories are less detailed, because VoiceOver having its own gestures and being an overlay of the over the top of the normal iOS interface kind of requires a different level of detail. So you might, or depending on your point of view, you might call my VoiceOver chapters level of detail excruciating, or you might think it's just pretty good because there's step-by-steps that will take you through just about every conceivable aspect of using VoiceOver to run an iOS device. The other chapters are also step-by-step, and so I show you generally how to configure features. Once I've shown you what all the features are, how to configure them, then I try to give you some practical guidance on how to use your iOS device. Now that you know how to use those features. So, for example, in the low vision chapter, once I tell you where what all the features are and what all the various options that you have for using those features, then I go into some mainstream features of iOS that are also beneficial to low vision, like some of the font adjustments and changes in contrast and brightness that you can do in apps and outside of the accessibility settings. And so that's kind of the structure for part 2. And then part 3, the final section of chapters, is there's chapter 8 is all about Apple apps. So I go through each and every Apple supplied app on all devices. For example, I might do 10 or 12 pages on Mail or Safari because those are major important apps, and I try to tell you from an accessibility point of view the things that you need to know. So I'm not giving you an exhaustive Safari primer, but I'm telling you everything about Safari that's relevant to using it with accessibility features. And then when we get down to minor apps like Clock or Contacts or Calculator or something, I'm not going to give you as much detail, but I'm going to talk about accessibility. For example, I'm going to say that in Calculator or Weather, there are accessibility challenges because of the colors and the contrast of the interface. And so here's ways that you can mitigate some of those problems if you're a low vision user and have trouble using those apps. Then chapter 9 is about 100 different apps organized into categories, just general usage categories. There's also accessibility, but I have productivity and games and reading and writing and entertainment and lifestyle, all the normal categories you'd expect to see. But the apps I've chosen, number 1, have to have outstanding accessibility, and number 2, have to be great apps. I guess I should reverse that order. They're great apps that happen to have outstanding accessibility. And then there's no really accessible crummy apps in that chapter. And then there's
Good
a
move,
section.
Shelley. Good move, Shelley.
Then there's the section that is all about apps that are specifically oriented for accessibility. So the app itself enhances your accessibility. And then finally, at long last, there are several appendices that go through all of the VoiceOver gestures as well as the keyboard commands you can use with a Bluetooth keyboard and VoiceOver, and then finally the keyboard commands you can use if you have a refreshable Braille display and want to connect it to your iOS device. So I try to be comprehensive, and we added, depending on what format you're in, I guess we added 40, 50 pages for iOS 8, something like that.
Wow. Okay, yeah, let's finish with the book things, and there's one more thing I want to ask you about. Where to folks go to get the book? How much is it? All the specifics.
My website is iosaccessbook.com. You can buy the book in EPUB format, which is readable in iBooks or any EPUB reader out there for the folks in the accessibility community. You can read it with VoiceStream Reader. You can read it with any app that will open up an ebook, EPUB. Also, by popular demand, and this isn't something I intended to do, but a lot of folks wanted a PDF version of the book, so I made one. Or you can buy it from the iTunes store. I don't make quite as much dough if you do that, but some people, it's the same book. The EPUB is available from my site or on the iTunes store is the same. It's not a multi-touch book or anything, but price is $20 wherever you buy it, $20 US. I'm happy to say that it's on it's on like 51 iTunes country stores. So
Wow.
If you're in Bulgaria and you'd like a copy, it's in English, but I'd be happy to sell you one. So you go to iosaccessbook.com. If you click the buy book link, you'll see all the buttons that will take you to the places you can buy it. And I hope people like it. Oh,
Great.
there's also a free sample chapter on the website, Chapter 5, the Siri chapter, which is fun for anybody, whether you're an accessibility user or not. I've listed an awful lot of Siri commands, so you can download that free and get a sense of my approach.
Great. That's great. The thing I wanted to make sure we ask about, there's a service app. I haven't used it, so I'm not quite sure out there, who is or that is offering assistance for the accessibility community, particularly sight challenged individuals, to get help in identifying things, seeing what they are. You probably know a lot more about this than I do. What's the reaction to that? Is that a good thing? Is it not such a good thing? Hopefully, it is at least a little bit of a good thing.
So this is an app called Be My Eyes, and it's gotten a lot of press in the mainstream world as well as the accessibility world this past month. And apparently it came to be at a startup weekend where a couple of guys in Denmark got together and came up with this idea. Then they got some funding, and so it was just released. And it's basically a social networking, crowdsourcing, whatever buzzwords you'd like to apply, way to provide assistance to blind users. And the way it works is you sign up as either a sighted or a blind user. If you're a blind user and you have something that you need to borrow a pair of eyes for, like let's say you want to read the serial number on the back of your television, or maybe the menu on your TV screen, or you'd like to read a cereal box, or anything that's sort of temporary where you could just really use a set of eyes right now. You make your request, and then people who have signed up as sighted volunteers will answer that request, and using your iOS camera, you the blind user, point at the thing that you'd like identified, explained, described, and the sighted user assists you with that. So it's kind of a cool concept that has gotten a lot of attention primarily in the mainstream community, and I think the reason for that is I think it's something that folks in the mainstream community understand. Because from that perspective, well, what blind user wouldn't like to borrow a pair of eyes every now and again? I mean, everybody who's blind or visually impaired at one time has said, "What does this say? How do I do this? Can you read the screen to me or whatever?" And so it's a good idea. I think in the accessibility community, there's a lot of interest in it. It's somewhat guarded because I think, for one thing, there are a lot of ways to get things done on our own that sighted people aren't necessarily aware of. And so I think there's a tendency to believe that we need this kind of assistance a little more than we do. And that's not to be, that's not to say anything negative about the app or the folks who developed it, who I think absolutely have the best intentions. And I think it's a great idea. I also think that there are a lot of people who have some privacy concerns about this. Obviously, you volunteer to let somebody look into see what your iPhone camera sees, but there are potential issues for somebody. You obviously wouldn't want to be showing your bank statement or your credit card number or any of that kind of stuff, and that requires judgment on the part of the user to not make information available or that they shouldn't be making available. And I think that, like I say, it's a mixed bag, only in the sense that I think there's so many things in accessibility technology that have happened over the past year, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever, that are more significant and more interesting, both in terms of challenges and both in terms of positive developments. But this is the thing that's gotten so much attention because I think a lot of people, like I say, in the sighted community can get it. Oh, well, that makes sense. I understand that. But if you tell me that you have an issue with the way an app interacts with voiceover, that's a little more technically challenging for somebody to understand. I mean, you and I had a fairly detailed conversation about the intricacies and the ins and outs of how voiceover and these various features work. And if you don't use them every day, there's a certain remoteness, but everybody can understand. Blind person doesn't have eyes, useful vision. A person with a vision can provide that service. That's pretty straightforward and pretty understandable. And I should say that the service has it slammed their servers the first weekend, and they've worked out some quirks, and there's some technical glitches that have been worked out. So it apparently is running fairly well for the moment. But it's an interesting idea. And we'll see whether it's something that blind folks adopt en masse. I'm not clear that it will be. I think I think blind people haven't quite figured out how they necessarily want to use it, to be honest. I've talked to a number of people and they've said to me, I'm not sure how I use it. And that's probably one thing that would be really surprising to people who are potential volunteers. It's like, well, why wouldn't you know how you want it? Well, because I figured out how to live all this time. I figured out how to do things without this kind of assistance before. So I haven't figured out yet what I would want from that service.
And if you stop and think about it from both sides make perfect sense. You're right. The sight challenge people have figured out ways around whatever the challenge is. And sure,
Yeah.
I can also see times when something that hasn't been figured out or just pops up on a once or very occasional basis. Sure, that'd be great. I can also see the other side where this would seem to be a very nice thing to be able to do to help someone see something that they are having problems seeing or recognize something. But boy, just like everything else, Shelly, you gotta think a little bit before you just dive into some of these services that sound so great. They're privacy concerns, security concerns, all that stuff.
And then there's trust issues because I think a lot of people assume because they would attempt to be as helpful as they possibly could in good faith, but a blind person isn't necessarily in a position to trust a stranger to help them. Right. And I don't mean in terms of nefarious things. I just mean in terms of if I'm standing at a street corner and you offer to assist me, if I am going to rely on your assistance as opposed to using my own skills, whether I have vision or whether I don't, if you offer to assist me and I say, yes, Chuck, thank you, I'll have you assist me, I'm trusting that you will do a competent job of it. I'm relying upon you. And so if I'm a blind user and I say, wow, I've just got a new television and I'd like to program it and I can only do it on the screen. And that's a trivial example. It's not a life or death thing, obviously. But if I'm going to use Be My Eyes, part of me in the back, I'm thinking, how can I rely on this person to explain things in a way that is useful and competent,
I'm right there with you. This is a poor analogy, but just go with me on it. But it's like getting Mac advice from websites that you may not know, people you may not. It's on the internet, right? So it's got to be true,
right.
And we've seen more than one person click a certain pop-up ad or a certain banner for some utility, and then they call me or call you and like, oh my God, my machine is, it's turned green and upside down, and how do I get rid of this? And so, it again, when you step back and really look at it, there's a lot of sincerity, I think, here on both sides, but there's some legitimate concerns that it all needs to be taken very seriously.
It'll be interesting to see how it develops. I look forward to seeing that. And I'm, and we're always put on our guard too. Whenever you sort of hope that there will be some mainstream appreciation of issues related to accessibility. I always preach that all the time. I'm always trying to get my friends in the mainstream world to sort of to take a little bit more of a concerted look at what's going on in accessibility. But then when they do, we always get a little bit nervous. We want to make sure they get it right, So we're human too,
Sure. Well,
it's like, oh, you're paying attention to me. You're shining the bright light on me. Are you using the right, whether it's inclusive language, that's a lesser thing, or are you actually getting it? Are you getting, to use a term that one of my favorite terms is inspiration porn. I mean, it sounds really awesome and it's inspiring and it's warm and it's fuzzy, but is it accurate, or are we just sort of trading in the feelings, the desire to be helpful and considerate and all that stuff, but not necessarily getting to the sort of technical nitty gritty of what's needed and wanted. And that's what Be My Eyes has sort of conjured for me. But again, without any criticism for what those guys are doing, the tool is kind of separate from the community that it may potentially spawn. And so that's, I think, the thing that will be interesting to see is what kind of community does it spawn. There have been services like this in the past that don't do live video-based help, but a blind person, for example, this is my favorite. There was a CAPTCHA reading service. So you could point your camera at the CAPTCHA on your screen and you could send out a request, and then a volunteer would pick it up and send you a text back and tell you what the CAPTCHA said, which was a great service, but a lot less sort of intrusive and personal than video-based services where you're talking to strangers.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, all of this does help heighten the accessibility awareness. Hopefully, interviews like this will make people think a little bit more about it than just hit it at that very top level,
Sure.
superficial level. Um, and it's a slow process, but I think it's a slow process with just about any subject you want to talk about.
Yeah.
If it when it applies to you, it applies to you deeply. When it doesn't,
Indeed.
we all hit it with a glancing blow and move on. And
Yeah.
sometimes you got to drag people back and say, "Pay just a little more attention, please," and they do,
Yeah.
and they do. Shelly, it's great to see you. I'm really excited about this book. I'm hoping that a lot of people will go and check it out. People that are in the accessibility community, they will get some benefits out of it. And folks, maybe if you're not in the accessibility, go check it out or point someone that you know that could benefit from it to it. Shelly obviously does a lot of work. You can tell she's a little bit passionate about it. Not much, just a little.
Just a little.
Just a
No,
little.
people have said very nice things. I've really good reaction to the first edition of the book, and I hope I've continued in the same vein for this one. And everybody knows somebody peripherally who may have an accessibility need, and a lot of folks now have somebody in their family, and their question is, how should I help that person with technology? Should I get them a Mac? Should I get them an iPad? And if I do, am I going to be able to do the tech support? Am I going to be able to help them with what they need if it's an accessibility issue? And I mean, I've had that in my own family with believe it or not, I do tech support for other people who have accessibility issues in my family. So,
Sure.
I hope folks who have questions like that about what maybe the book can answer the question as to whether an Apple device is the right thing for you, maybe not, but it'll at least tell you what's available. So,
And, the simple fact is that any of us could find ourselves in the middle of the accessibility community at any point through accident, disease, just plain old age.
age-related, there's an awful lot of age-related disability,
Yeah.
a lot of vision, a lot of physical and motor, but especially visual disabilities. Almost everybody gets some sort of visual disability if they live long enough.
Yeah. So don't think that this doesn't apply to you because it could at any time. Shelly, please come back anytime. And
Thank you.
This is a fascinating subject, and I really appreciate your willingness to be patient with us and walk us through it.
Well, I appreciate your time as always, Chuck, and it's good to be able to talk about accessibility to hopefully an audience of folks who maybe I was able to tell you some things you didn't know, and if not, well, I'm always around, and people can find me out there on the internets and ask me questions if they have them.
And by all means, please, I know you have the book website. Plug any website or Twitter or Facebook accounts or whatever that so people can get in touch with you.
There is a Facebook page for the book, although I think basically if you follow me around on Twitter, you'll learn all you need to know. My Twitter name is Shelly, Shellly. I got in early. There's also a Twitter for the book called iOS Access Book. So if you follow me either of those places, you'll see me pretty quickly.
Great. And I'll make sure I have links in the show notes for all that so that you can find it easily.
Thanks, Chuck. This was fun.
It was. We'll see you next time. And thank you. I definitely did learn some things.
Great.
Folks, I hope you learned some things too. This is a very important subject. I hope we shed just a little bit of light on it. And I'm sorry about any of those puns that end up coming out. But
we like puns.
Well, good. I'm glad because I noticed I was saying things along the way that were unintentional, but they were punny.
We do it all the time. And it's just a little tip for everybody out there. It's okay to say the word "see" in front of a blind person. It doesn't freak us out. It doesn't. We're all good with it.
Good to know. Good to know. Folks, check the show notes. We'll have links to Shelly's book, to everything that Shelly had, all her presences. So if you want to get in touch, you can. Please drop me an email at chuck@macvoices.com or drop me a message on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the MacVoices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free MacVoices magazine on Flipboard by visiting macvoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.